All right, next let's cover some cultural geography of Southeast Asia. And this is showing some of the ethnic mosaic of Southeast Asia. And these are pretty broad groups. This doesn't really do it justice because on these different islands, there's different languages and dialects. And because this area is very mountainous, there's a lot of isolated groups with different languages as well. This next figure kind of shows us a little better. Um, if you look at all these different numbers, these are different languages and dialects among the different islands, and even different ones among in Southeast Asia. Just for an example, if we see number 56 here, these are this is where Hmong is a dominant language. So Hmong, which are familiar because of the amount of people who live in the valley who speak Hmong, that's actually a kind of a isolated language group within the highlands of Southeast Asia. And you can see, and I will include, there's a link here, there's another, there's a more detailed map of ethno-linguistic areas, but it's kind of hard to show in a PowerPoint. I'm going to put a link to it in the lecture notes. One thing, let me back up a bit too. You see also some kind of purple areas here. This is where Chinese is a dominant language. And one reason is because of the migration of people from China into Southeast Asia. And this is primarily into the urban areas or cities of Southeast Asia. So there are major concentrations of people from China that live in Southeast Asia as well. So for example, in Singapore, most people in Singapore are Asian or of Chinese heritage. Some of them coming a long time ago, and some of them more recently, but Singapore is a mix of people from, there's mostly from China and India, and then a few other, also Malaysian. So the point being is that Southeast Asia is kind of like what we call a shatter belt region. It's very culturally diverse because of the mountainous areas. It's on the Pacific Ring of Fire. Mountains tend to isolate people, and also because of the islands. Islands also tend to isolate people. And on the second thing on top of that is the presence of what's called the overseas Chinese. And these are Chinese settlers. They don't really come to farm. Mostly they're coming into urban areas for trade. And one thing important about the overseas Chinese, and this is also true of in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other places, is that they tend to build trading relationships between those places, those urban areas, and the Chinese mainland. If we look at religions in the world, let's zoom in a little bit. This is from a different book, but it's showing some of the dominant religions in Asia overall. We've talked about Hinduism and Islam in South Asia. We didn't talk as much about China. Buddhism is a big, and Buddhism is also very important in the mainland part of Southeast Asia. So particularly in places like Thailand, Cambodia, in particular, Myanmar, these are where Buddhism is the dominant religion. And then Islam is present in the insular part, and particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia. And then lastly, you have Catholicism because of the colonial history in the Philippines and East Timor. So just to recap, we have three different groups. We have in Southeast Asia, we have Buddhism, Islam, and then Christianity, particularly Catholicism. Buddhism is dominant on the mainland part, including Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and other parts. Whereas in the insular part, you have two different ones going on, primarily Islam in Malaysia and Indonesia. In fact, Indonesia has more Muslims or people who practice Islam than any other country in the world. Part of that is because Indonesia is just so big. Remember, it's the fourth largest country in the world. And then since Islam is a dominant religion there, the largest Muslim country in the world is not, by population, is not in the Middle East, it's here in Southeast Asia. And lastly, we have Catholicism in Little East Timor over here. Remember, Portuguese colony, Portuguese Catholic, East Timor Catholic. Same goes for the Philippines. And this impacts not only the culture, but also demographics like population growth. For example, I'll include a video that talks a little bit about the Philippines and how their population is growing rapidly compared to their resources. And, you know, part of that is because that most people practice a religion that is looks down on birth control. And because of that, that affects government policies on birth control and then thus affects population growth. This is a figure showing the Islamic world. And one thing we talked about when we talked about the Middle East is that the Middle East is where Islam began. It's where it has the highest percentages of people who practice Islam. But the Islamic world is much bigger. It extends into Central Asia, into India, and down into Southeast Asia as well, particularly in Indonesia. We talked about expansion diffusion versus relocation diffusion. And the East Indies, which is now Indonesia, is a good example of where Islam expanded through relocation diffusion. This is a Buddhist temple in Thailand, Thailand being on the mainland. Buddhism is a dominant religion. In Myanmar, Buddhism is a dominant religion, but there are minorities. There are Muslim minorities in the country, and called the Rohingya. And the Rohingya have been persecuted by the Buddhist majority. And I'll include a video that explains a lot of that. But one thing I'll point out, they're in the what's called the Rakhine state, and the Rakhine state is here. And if we look at, well, what's near the Rakhine state is next to Bangladesh. If you recall, Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country, and that extends down into this Rakhine state. In fact, the people who live here are kind of somewhat related to the people in Bangladesh. They're a minority in the country, and the Buddhist majority has oppressed them over time.